Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Friedman. He is the William Joseph Maier Professor of Political Economy and formerly Chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard University. And today we're going to talk about his latest book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. So, Dr. Friedman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be with you.
Okay, great. So, it's interesting because in the book, uh, I wouldn't say perhaps that you present a complete history of economics, but you at least present a good part of it. So, my first question would be, when would you say economics as a discipline started, really?
What we think of as modern Western economics, I believe, started in the 18th century. Now, as I'm very clear in the book, people have been thinking about economic issues since long before that. People were thinking about economic issues 2,000 years ago. So to claim that nobody had any interest in these topics before the 18th century would be absurd. But I think the recognizable outlines of what we do today as modern Western economics took shape in the 18th century. And although Adam Smith had precursors, and in the book I talk about many of those, both in France and England and elsewhere, uh, I give a lot of the credit to Adam Smith and his contemporaries, especially David Hume, for giving us modern Western economics as we know it. And as I'm replying to you, I realize that I keep repeating the phrase modern Western because that's important in answering your question. To repeat what I said before, uh, humans have been thinking about issues of what we would regard as economic questions for a very, very long time, but most of those thoughts are not what have shaped what we do today. And I think what we do today really does date to the era of Smith and Hume and their contemporaries.
Mhm. But since in the book you're basically talking about the relationship between religion and capitalism or economics, is it that before Christianity we know if any other religion influenced economic thinking?
Yes, just to take the obvious example for Western thought, before Christianity came on the scene, there was the Hebrew Bible. And there's a lot in the Hebrew Bible about economic behavior and about economic relations between individuals and among groups of individuals. To repeat what I said before, we don't want to think that this is the underpinnings of modern Western economics as we had it, but there is certainly a lot in the Hebrew Bible about questions that are identifiably economics. It's about ways of conducting market relationships. It's about relationships between employers and the workers who are in their employ. There are things about money. And all of this long predates the beginnings of Christianity. So the answer to your question is yes.
Mhm. So, but is it that religion influences how economists think about economics, or is it that it influences how society is structured, including how economics is done in a particular society?
Well, the second part of what you said is, of course, true. And I think this has long been recognized. To repeat what I said a minute ago, even if you go back to the Hebrew Bible, so we're now back, 2,500 years ago, there's an enormous amount about the way the religious thinking of the time structured market relationships, who does what. There's a whole set of laws in the Hebrew Bible governing things like suppose I borrow your ox and the ox is injured. Well, what kind of reparations am I supposed to pay to you? There are things about treatment of the poor, statements in the Hebrew Bible that if you have a vineyard, for example, you're not allowed to reap or if you have a wheat field, you're not allowed to reap the edges and the corners of the field. You have to leave that for the poor. Or if you've harvested your grapes and you're taking your grapes to market and some grapes fall off of the wagon, you're not allowed to pick up the grapes. You have to leave those for the poor. And again, about treatment of your workers. So all of this is, of course, about economics, but it's not about economic thinking in the sense of modern Western economic thinking. I don't believe the authors of the Hebrew Bible thought in terms of economic thinking. They were thinking about economic issues, but they didn't see themselves thinking about economics, if I can draw that distinction.
Mm-hmm. But then your book is focused mostly on how religion influenced economic thinking, correct?
The book seeks to explain where our modern Western economics comes from. So, look, I'm an economist, and I came at this from the direction of the economics, not the religion. I'm not a religion scholar. So I came at it from asking the question of where did our modern Western economics come from, and why did it emerge when it did, and where it did. And that led me to looking at a variety of influences, most of which are perfectly well known, but the one that struck me as having been overlooked, and that's why I chose to write the book on it, is the influence of religious thinking on our modern Western economics. And it so happened that people like Adam Smith and David Hume, who gave us modern Western economics, very much lived in the English-speaking Protestant world, and therefore the religious influences on their thinking were what was happening in the English-speaking Protestant world. Now, if I had been a religious scholar and I had come at it from the other direction, I would have said, well, how about Roman Catholic thinking? I'm aware that in Thomist thinking associated with Aquinas and the scholastics, for example, there's a lot of thought about the way in which moral principles should affect economic relations. I didn't see that had much to do with the origins of modern Western economics, because that's not the world Adam Smith and David Hume lived in. They lived not in the 12th century, but the 18th century. They lived not in Spain and Italy. They lived in Scotland. And I suppose they must have known some Roman Catholics, but I don't think Roman Catholics played a major role at that time in the intellectual life of either England or Scotland. And we were talking just a moment ago about Jewish thinking. If I had been approaching this from the other direction, from asking, let's talk about the various ways in which religious thinking has influenced economics and economic thinking, I might have included a fair amount on the Hebrew Bible. I could have done that. But it's not obvious that, in fact, I've actually looked. It's not clear that Adam Smith ever met a Jew. He probably did, but there's no evidence that he did. We do know that David Hume did, incidentally. When David Hume lived in Paris, he did meet a Jew, a Sephardic Jew named Isaac de Pinto, from the family, presumably of Portuguese origin. And Smith and de Pinto had a lively correspondence on markets which had been published. But it would be an enormous stretch to say that Isaac de Pinto via David Hume had any significant influence on modern Western economics. So again, the key thing is that I'm approaching it from the direction of asking where our modern Western economics came from and why it emerged, where it did, when it did. And that's what led me to focus on the Protestant thinking, and in particular the Protestant thinking of the English-speaking world, and then in particular what was going on in that Protestant thinking in the 18th century.
Mhm. So, do you think that one of the reasons why capitalism first arose in England was because of this Protestant influence?
Well, here we have to be very careful because there's a difference between talking about capitalism
Okay.
as a form of economic organization and talking about modern Western economics as a body of intellectual thought. I don't think it's fair to say that capitalism as a form of economic organization emerged first in England. If anything, I would point, I suppose, to northern Italy long before, with some of these great banking houses in northern Italy, and then up through Germany in the Middle Ages. The Fuggers, for example, were the leading bankers, and then on into the Netherlands was very important in the 17th century. Dutch capitalism had its golden age, as they call it. So I don't want to claim that capitalism as an economic form of organization and behavior began in either England or Scotland. It didn't. What I think did importantly emerge out of Scotland in the 18th century was the body of thinking about capitalism that we regard as modern Western economics.
Mhm. And was Adam Smith religious himself?
No, and that's an important issue that I spend quite a bit of time on in the book. There's no evidence that Adam Smith had any particular religious commitment. As a matter of taking up his professorship at the University of Glasgow, he did have to appear at the Presbyterian consistory in Glasgow and take an oath to the Westminster Confession, which was the standard confession, religious confession then used by the Church of Scotland. But there's no evidence that he took this particularly seriously. And we do know that when he took the oath, he asked to be excused from the requirement to start each lecture with a prayer. His request was denied, and so he started each lecture with a very short prayer. So there's no evidence that he was a religious man. And for David Hume, quite the contrary. David Hume was an outspoken opponent of any kind of organized religion. He was probably an atheist. If he wasn't an atheist, he was certainly an agnostic. And so my story is absolutely not that these were religiously committed individuals self-consciously bringing their religious beliefs to bear on their professional work. And then the challenge to me in the book is to explain, well, if that wasn't the case, what did account for the influence of religious thinking on their economic thinking? And the answer that I give, and I cite lots of people, starting with Einstein. Einstein's famous phrase is that scientific thinking is an outgrowth of pre-scientific thinking. Einstein had the concept of what translates into English as a worldview or a picture of the world. In Einstein's German, it was the built die Welt. And Einstein's idea was that every body, and not just physical scientists, but creative thinkers of all kind. Einstein pointed to philosophers, to painters, to poets. Everybody has in his or her mind a view of the world, a built die Welt, and that leads to thought. And my predecessor at Harvard, Joseph Schumpeter, had the same view. Schumpeter, in his history of economic analysis, had this concept of pre-analytic vision. And it was sufficiently important that when Schumpeter wrote about it, he put capital V on the word vision, So pre-analytic vision with a capital letter. And his idea was that anytime an economist sits down to do his or her analysis, that person already has in mind what he called a vision of the world, a pre-analytic vision. And so the argument I make in the book is that because they lived in a world in which religion was more central and more pervasive and more multidimensional than anything we know in today's Western society, Smith and Hume and their contemporaries were influenced by these new and highly contended currents of thought in the religious thinking of the English-speaking Protestant world, even though, to get back to your direct question, they were not religious individuals in any way.
Mm-hmm. But, I mean, were they influenced by other thinkers who were themselves religious?
Well, could well be. As I explain in the book, there were a number of precursors to Smith's thinking. He did not make this up out of whole cloth. There were a number of people in England and also a number of people in France. France is important in this regard because Smith lived in France for 2.5 years when he was first starting the project, and also because some of these French thinkers had had their work translated into English, and Smith was aware of it. And so one would have to go through point by point, and some of these earlier thinkers were religious individuals, some were not. So, for example, in England, I would argue that the most important of the pre-Smithian thinkers was Bernard Mandeville, who was absolutely not a religious man. But by contrast, Joseph Butler was a bishop in the Church of England. So he clearly was a religious man. And his protege, Josiah Tucker, was a religious man. And they thought about these matters. Turning to France, I would say the most important influence was Pierre Nicole. Nicole was a French clergyman, but almost equally important was Francois Quesnay, who was a great friend of Smith. Smith met him when he lived in Paris, and Smith said that if Quesnay had been alive, Smith would have dedicated the Wealth of Nations to Quesnay. Quesnay died two years earlier, so alas, Smith couldn't do that. But Smith was a great friend of Quesnay. Quesnay, to my knowledge, was not a religious man. So the answer is yes in some cases, no in others. But the key engines of thought, I think, were Smith and Hume and their contemporaries in the Scottish Enlightenment. And what we pretty well know is that they were not religious figures. After all, these men became international celebrities in their own lifetimes. And as a result, we know a lot about them biographically. And it's very easy to say, no, they were not religiously inclined individuals.
Mm-hmm. When I asked you about the emergence of capitalism, you mentioned, for example, northern Italy and the Netherlands. So capitalism preceded these thinkers, right? These economic thinkers.
Yes, I believe that's right. As I emphasize in the book, the central element of Smith's contribution was to recognize the all-important role of market competition, and market competition was growing. I mean, Smith lived in what was becoming an increasingly commercial society, and he saw this up close. He lived in Glasgow, he lived in Edinburgh, he lived in London. All of these were commercial places, and increasingly so, but no one would argue that market competition began in the 18th century. It goes way back. People were competing in various ways. I've mentioned in particular the Netherlands in the 17th century, but On back before that, in the Middle Ages, Europe had fairs of various kinds. And even again, you go back to some of the thinkers we were talking about before. Think about Aquinas's views on the just price and all of that. If there hadn't been some elements of markets and competition in Aquinas's day, he never would have, I think it never would have occurred to him to write what he wrote. So market competition goes back a long way.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of the aspects in which how people think about capitalism that changed after Adam Smith and David Hume?
I think the central contribution that Smith made is embodied in what today we still in economics call the first fundamental welfare theorem. And it's the idea that people acting on no more than their own self-interest can, and under the right circumstances will, make other people, in addition to themselves, better off by their actions. And furthermore, the right circumstances are competitive markets, and the driving mechanism that brings this result about is precisely market competition. I think that's the essence of the Smithian contribution. Some of these precursors of Smith, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago, people like Pierre Nicole in France or Bernard Mandeville in England, had the intuition that people acting in their own self-interest could make others better off also. I mean, you know, at some level, you just look around to commercial society, you see this happening. But they didn't really understand why it was. They didn't understand the mechanism. And I think Smith's great contribution is to establish that the condition for that result to emerge is markets, and the mechanism by which it occurs is competition. And that's really what the Wealth of Nations is all about. There's all this detailed description of how markets work and how competition works and how competitively set wages and prices steer the allocation of economic activity to a place that makes other people better off. And incidentally, to cite another influence on Smith's thinking that I emphasize in the book, he's very much a Newtonian. And when you read the description in the Wealth of Nations about how all this works, it's just striking to see how Newtonian the language is. If you didn't pay much attention, he could be describing what makes the planets circle around the sun. Well, he's not. He's describing how wages and prices get the economy to the right place. But the whole idea of system and mechanism is one that he got from Newton, because he lived in a generation in which all of these English and Scottish intellectuals were educated in Newtonian precepts.
Mm-hmm. Are there aspects of Protestant thinking that translate directly into capitalist economic thinking or how capitalism works?
Well, the great book on the influence of Protestant thinking on capitalism as a form of economic organization and as a motivator of individual behavior is Max Weber's book from about a century and a quarter ago called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And the relationship between my book and Weber's is an interesting one. Weber emphasized the role of people's belief in predestination, the idea that whether any individual was or was not to be saved in the afterlife was a matter, according to Calvin, that's determined before any individual was even born. And indeed, according to Calvin, not only before the individual was born, but before the world was even created. And so, of course, it followed that there's nothing that any individual can do, again, this is according to Calvin, to influence whether he or she is among the saved. And Weber's idea was that this belief subjected individuals to what he called existential anxiety over whether they were or were not among the saved. And therefore, people were in search of not causal behavior, but external signs that they were among the saved. People believed that if they worked diligently at their calling, if they were thrifty, they didn't live lavishly, they saved their money, they started new businesses. Weber's notion was that all of these signs of hard work and diligence and industriousness would be, again, not causal because they couldn't be causal, but they would be external signs that people were among the elect. Now, the interesting relationship between Weber's idea and mine is that the key motivating force to which I point in trying to understand what gave Smith his thinking was the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism. So in many ways, my book is Weber upside down. And now, how could the two both be right? And I think there are two parts of that answer. One is that Weber is looking at a different time period than we are. And exactly as your question before led us to discuss how there was capitalism long before there was Adam Smith, Weber is looking primarily at the 17th century. He's thinking about all of these Dutch Calvinists and English Puritans walking around in the 17th century, subject to this existential anxiety, as he called it, and therefore thinking they'd better work diligently at their calling. I'm looking a century later. I'm looking at the 18th century when Smith and Hume lived. And it is true, as I explain in my book, that the high tide in the English-speaking world of belief in predestinarian Calvinism was the 17th century. In fact, I date it to a specific date. I mentioned the Westminster Confession before. I date it to 1647, which was when the Westminster Confession was promulgated, and it was downhill from there. By the time we get to the 18th century, people no longer believed in that, and they were moving away from it. And I think it was the more expansive, more optimistic view of the possibilities for human action, human choice, human agency that enabled Smith to come to his insights. But that's a matter of being a century later than Weber. So the religious thinking was different in the two centuries. And then another difference between my book and Weber's is that Weber, I'm an economist. Weber was a sociologist. Weber was interested in explaining the behavior of ordinary people. I'm interested in explaining here the thinking of individuals, and moreover, the individuals whose names we would recognize as being economists. So these are the intellectual elite, but that's who gave us economics, and that's why I'm interested in their thinking. So my book is, in effect, the reverse of Weber, but I think they're both right.
Mm-hmm. But Hume and Smith were Enlightenment thinkers, so would you say that then religion could have also influenced the development of the Enlightenment, or is that something you don't touch on in the book?
I'm going to duck that question if you don't mind. I think you have to be more of an Enlightenment scholar, more of a historian of philosophy than I am. To have an informed view of the subject. The standard view is that the Enlightenment was a movement away from religious thinking, that it was a movement away from conceptions of a God-centered universe, toward what we in our modern vocabulary call secular humanism, and I know that. But I'm also aware that there are some historians of philosophy who do argue that there were religious influences on the Enlightenment, and I don't feel competent to wade into that particular dispute. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to duck that question.
Yeah, of course, no problem.
It's a very interesting one, but you'd have to get one of my colleagues from the philosophy department to address that.
Mhm. So, can we say that there are any other economists after Hume and Smith that were also influenced by religion?
Yes, indeed. And in the latter half of my book, after Smith's death in 1790, my book moves to the United States, where I trace the evolution of economic thinking from that time to ours. And right through the 19th and the 20th centuries, there were economists whose views were influenced by religious thinking. And just to cite a few examples, in the first half of the 19th century, it turns out that the central figures in the development of American economics were almost all either clergymen or very closely aligned with one or another Protestant denomination. The author of the best-selling economics textbook in the United States before our Civil War was Francis Wayland. Francis Wayland was a Baptist clergyman and was the president of Brown University, very much a Baptist, in the same way that my university was a Puritan foundation. Brown was a Baptist foundation. The author of the second best-selling textbook, a competing book, was Francis Bowen. Bowen was not an ordained clergyman, but Bowen was very close to the Unitarian establishment. He was at Harvard, and Harvard by this time had moved from being Puritan to being Unitarian. The instructor of the first college university course that we know of in economics in America was a man named John McVicker, and McVicker was an Episcopal priest, taught at Columbia, which was an Episcopal foundation. So it was certainly true in the first half of the 19th century. Moving to the second half of the century, all of these figures who were instrumental in the 1880s in in establishing the American Economics Association, people like John Bates Clark, like Richard T. Ely, and others, were not ordained clergymen, but were very close to what, as I explained in the book, was called the social gospel movement in the American Protestant churches. So I think right through that period, there were many leading economists who were very much influenced by religious thinking.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, those are economists from the 19th century, the ones you mentioned.
Yes, that's right. Bowen and McVicker and Wayland were all active in the period in the first half of the century. And Wayland and John Bates Clark in the latter half of the century.
Mm-hmm. And what about in the 20th century? Were there any economic thinkers that you also include in the way they were influenced by religion?
I think the answer here starts to become no. As I explain in the book, a standard view of the development of any scientific discipline is that it's in the early days of the discipline when it's most influenced or most subject to influence by external factors like religion, for example, in its fundamental concepts. And as disciplines evolve and mature, increasingly they develop a momentum of their own, and their basic fundamental theoretical concepts become isolated from outside influence, and instead the outside influence is a matter of methodology and application, and in the case of economics, policy. And so the part of my book that deals with the 20th century focuses on this transition to the point where we are today, where I don't think you can look at the work of most professional economists and identify any specific religious influences. By contrast, especially here in America, our public discussion of economics and our debate over economic policy is very much one that has religious influences, and I discuss a lot of those in the book. So it's an interesting transition. The historian of science who has, I think, been most clear in articulating this view of how the subjectivity to external influences changes as a scientific discipline matures is Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn is most famous for his work on what he called the paradigm shifts, but this is a different part of his work. But Kuhn outlined this this maturation process very clearly, and I think that's what we've seen in economics. As after all, if you go back to Adam Smith and David Hume, this was the very beginnings of modern Western economics. But here we are nearly 2.5 centuries later, and the discipline is by now, I wouldn't say it's fully matured, but it's quite mature compared to what it was then.
Mm-hmm. So, in the 20th century, what were some of the main economic thinkers there?
Well, I think the major force in the 20th century, especially, and here I'm referring especially to the United States, was a coming together of religious conservatism and economic conservatism in a way that's still with us, even though the original catalyst for that coming together has waned. The catalyst to which I point was the existential threat from world communism. What I think happened is that around the middle of the 20th century, in the decades following the Second World War, economic conservatives and religious conservatives came to understand that they were combating the same enemy. The religious conservatives understood correctly that communism was the antithesis of Western religion. The economic conservatives came to understand also correctly that communism was the antithesis of market capitalism. And as a result, especially in the United States, to a limited extent elsewhere, we had this blending, merging of economic conservatism and religious conservatism. And now, and I used the word catalyst a moment ago in describing this process quite deliberately, because in the same way that a catalyst in chemistry is something that triggers a reaction, and then after the catalyst is gone, the results of the reaction are still there, we all know that the threat of world communism is, of course, gone. There's still a few odd communist countries, but the notion that communism is going to take over the world is just perhaps by military force is long gone. But nonetheless, especially here in the United States, we have this very important to us unity between economic conservative thinking and religious conservatives, especially embodied in what we call the evangelical Protestant movement. And I point to evidence from voting behavior, evidence from survey behavior, questionnaires, to show that the evangelical community in the United States thinks very differently about economic questions than do the other Americans, including other Protestants. I mean, we have evangelical Protestants and we have what we call main Protestants. And the mainline Protestants do not differ very much from other Americans, but the evangelical Protestants absolutely do. And evangelical Protestants are a very large and potent and growing force in American politics, and they have quite distinct views on economic policy issues, and those views are very much aligned with the economic conservatives with which they came together in the middle of the 20th century, I think as a result of the communist threat.
Mm-hmm. And these evangelical Protestants, when exactly did they start to have a significant impact on politics?
I would say it's primarily in the years following the Second World War. As I trace out the history in the book, these evangelical Protestants were certainly a presence in America right through the 19th century. But I don't, in answer to your question, I don't think it would be possible to identify much of an influence that they would have had on economic policy. And then there was an attempt by evangelicals to have an influence on policy in the pre-World War II period, but it didn't go anywhere. And indeed, for a variety of ways that I'm happy to talk about, if you like, although it would take us in a different direction, the evangelicals in the pre-World War II period suffered some very serious reverses in their attempts to influence the country. I would say that the single example where evangelicals were very important in public policy in the United States in the pre-World War II period was our constitutional amendment for what we called prohibition, banning alcoholic beverages. And that was one of the reverses that they faced. Incidentally, it was a dramatic failure, and the Constitution, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution bans alcoholic beverages, and the 21st Amendment to the Constitution abolishes the 18th Amendment. So it was a big disaster, and they had other disasters as well. So I think it's not until the post-World War II period, and probably not until the advent of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, that the evangelical community really came into its own as a force in influencing economic policy. And that was 40 years ago, but this force is still very much with us.
Mm-hmm. And immediately after World War II, weren't there major changes in economic thinking? I mean, after the war, wasn't it the case that Keynesian economics was the dominant school of thought?
Yes, exactly so. But that would not have been a school of thinking that the evangelicals would have endorsed. So exactly as you say, the dominance of Keynesian economic thought and economic policy in the early post-World War II decades is, if anything, evidence that the evangelicals had not yet come into their own as a powerful influence over public economic policy. Now, let me also be clear that in a way that we were talking about a few minutes ago, what the evangelicals care about, like most American citizens, is not economic theory, but economic policy. I don't think the typical citizen, and here I don't think Americans are different from people in any other country. We economists think that our own thinking is, of course, fascinating, and we spend a lot of time on that. I don't think the typical citizen cares a bit what economists think. What they care about is the society in which they live and the way the policies their government pursues influences that policy and that society and influences their lives. So the influence that the evangelicals are pursuing and have pursued is not at the level of pursuing economic thinking by economists. It's about pursuing influencing economic policy.
And what happened after the rise of neoliberalism?
I see. There's a word that's used in neoliberalism is a word that's used in different ways in different contexts. Well, in the context in which we are speaking now, I would say that there were important elements of the neoliberal movement that were very much consistent with evangelical views. The evangelicals, for reasons that have quite deep theological roots, which I flesh out in the book, evangelicals are not very supportive of social reform movements and policies that do not have directly moral implications. So, for example, the evangelicals were in favor of banning alcoholic beverages. Back in the 19th century, the evangelicals were very much in favor of abolishing slavery in the United States. And that's because they placed moral interpretations on both of these. By contrast, the idea that we need to abolish poverty, that's not very high on the evangelical agenda, and therefore they tend not to support policies that are what we would think of as part of the modern welfare state. And indeed, one of the great puzzles that we have in America today, and that I take up in the latter part of my book, is why it is that so many of these evangelicals tend to vote in ways that run counter to their personal economic interest. To a greater extent than other Americans, evangelicals draw on what we call food stamps, that is, the ability to get free food. They draw on supplemental income assistance. They live in public housing, not all to be sure, but disproportionately, more so than other Americans. And yet evangelicals tend to vote for candidates and for the Republican Party, which is opposed to those programs. They often vote for candidates that would like to eliminate food stamps, that would like to cut back on supplemental assistance, like to get rid of public housing. Well, this is a great puzzle, and it's not escaped notice in our political science colleagues. I think the explanation for that kind of behavior on the part of our political science colleagues is seriously incomplete, because while they have explanations, those explanations don't give rise to, or they can't explain the fact that when asked about, do you favor welfare state policies, the evangelicals say, no, we don't. And I think this runs counter to the standard political science explanation. But I think these religious origins of their views of economic policy matters that I trace out in the book does help explain it.
Mm-hmm. And evangelicals also supported Trump, correct?
Yes, evangelicals are very much in favor of Trump. Evangelicals generally tend to support the Republican Party. And you see, that part is consistent. They voted for Trump, they voted for George Bush, they voted for Reagan. And this part is consistent with the explanation that our political science colleagues offer, because these Republican candidates tend to be against abortion, which the evangelicals do see in moral terms. They're against same-sex marriage and so forth. And so it's not that hard to say why they would vote for Republican candidates. What I think the standard political science explanation can't explain is why, when you ask them in polls, in public opinion surveys, on a standalone basis, do you favor these welfare state policies or not? Would you like to have government regulation of businesses that are polluting the rivers from which you get water or not? Would you like a smaller government or a bigger government? In all of these areas, evangelicals have very different economic ideas, meaning ideas about economic policy, than other Americans.
Mhm. And would you have any explanation for that?
And do I? Yes, I do. I think it goes back to this combination of non-predestinarian thinking, together with a view on a subject that we haven't talked about yet, and that's how to interpret the millennialist prophecies in the Bible. It wasn't always true, but especially in the last 100 years, almost all American evangelicals have been what we call pre-millennialist. And this is a particular interpretation of the millennial prophecies in the Bible, which have the important implication that secular progress in the world in which we live is not possible, that it's not going to take place until the second coming. And once that's happened, then individuals such as ourselves will no longer be here. And I think that it's for this reason, and I'm not the only person who thinks this, it's for this reason that evangelicals, while being in favor of progress on the moral front, like abolishing slavery, like abolishing alcoholic drinks, because they think that will bring forward in time the second coming, they're not very in favor of secular progress. Secular progress will wait until the world as we know it has been replaced by a different world.
Mhm. Okay, so what about the relationship between capitalism and political ideology? Because I think that if we look back in history, for example, in the 18th and 19th century, we had economic thinkers and political philosophers, both on the right and the left, that were either critical or for capitalism. And nowadays, I mean, if we look at the left-right wing divide, capitalism tends to be more associated with conservative thinking. So how do we make sense of that?
I think the phenomenon that you are describing is much more a European phenomenon than America. Than in America, we really don't have people in America who are eager to replace capitalism with something else. I mean, we're very aware of the shortcomings of capitalism and our way of addressing it. And like Europe, we too do not live in a pure, unfettered capitalist system. We have much less of a welfare state than in Europe, but we have one. It's certainly not the case that we have no welfare support. It's not the case that we have no regulation of business. But we see these matters differently than Europeans, And I think the difference goes right to the heart of the question that you asked. There's, except for fringe groups, there's basically nobody on the left in America who would like to replace capitalism with something else. So it's not something that we have in our country.
Mhm. When it comes to alternatives to capitalism like communism, do you know if it was also influenced by religion in any way?
Well, as I mentioned before, and here Marx was quite explicit, uh, communism, Marxist-Leninist style communism, is of course the absolute opponent of Western style religion. And so it's no surprise that in every country in which the communists gained power, one of the items that was high on their agenda was to suppress religion. And it's not surprising, therefore, that in these countries, just think they're right there in Europe, countries like Poland that had to live under communism, or like Hungary, in all of these countries, the church was then and remains, sharply anti-communist. But the same thing is true here. As I was explaining, people here in the United States didn't take communism very seriously until after the Second World War. But in 1949, the Soviet Union announced that it now had atomic weapons. And so people started to take the threat very seriously. Americans of my generation, I'm old enough that I remember when we used to have air raid drills. And looking back, they were rather silly, but I can tell you that when I was a child in school, we used to have regular drills in which we were made to shelter underneath our desks in case there was a nuclear attack. Now, again, if you think back on it, it's rather silly because suppose there had been a nuclear attack, what would hiding under a wooden desk have done for anybody? The whole idea today is silly. But I mention it simply to indicate how seriously we took the threat. And again, it followed because in 1949, the Soviets acquired not yet nuclear, nuclear followed, but acquired atomic weapons. So people took this very seriously, and American clergymen like Billy Graham used to preach about the communist threat all the time. And I think people did take that very seriously. So yes, we were focused on communism, and that lasted for quite some decades. I remember the Soviet Union didn't collapse until 1991. So if you go from 1949 to 1991, that's more than 4 decades in which people were taking this seriously.
Mhm. So I have one or two more questions, general ones to ask you. The first one, isn't capitalism a competitive system? I'm asking you that because since in the book where you were trying to establish a relationship between religion and the rise of capitalism, if we look into particularly the anthropological literature on religion, it seems to be a social institution that promotes cooperation and pro-social behavior. So wouldn't there be any sort of contradiction there?
In Roman Catholicism, the answer would certainly be yes. And this is why throughout the centuries, Roman Catholic thinkers have always taken a very negative view to many of them to the economics of communism. As I mentioned before, if you go to Poland or other countries that had to live under communism, Roman Catholic thinkers are, of course, sharply opposed to communism. But even there, the view toward the competitive aspects of communism are much less. The church, going back into the early days, was never had a very positive view of economic activity. Augustine, for example, had the view, Augustine, we're now back at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century. Augustine had the view that the lust for money was on a par with sexual lust and the lust for power over other human beings. These three were to be treated as the same and or in parallel, and coming right down through the Middle Ages. Roman Catholic thinking was never sympathetic to market competition. All of the scholastic Thomists focus on the just price. Think of that as the contrast to Smith and getting the price to the place that will steer the economy to the right place. It was all on justice in economic interpersonal dealings. So I think in Roman Catholic countries it's very different. Now Protestant countries have had a very different view, and that's why I think in the modern era the Netherlands and England have had, in the north of Germany, have had a very different experience, and of course the United States. So Protestant thinking is much more compatible with the idea of individualism, of people competing. And as I said before, in some strands of Protestant thinking, the idea, and this is Weber's idea, the notion that you compete economically and you're successful in the competition is not only not frowned on in religious terms, that's the sign that you're among the religiously elect. So I think it's very different in Protestant versus Roman Catholic countries.
Mm-hmm. So one final question, and of course we don't have a time machine to go back in time, but do you think that without Protestant religion or Protestant Catholicism, not Protestant Christianity, we would have capitalism?
And are you asking whether we would have capitalism in the sense of an existing form of economic behavior and organization, or are you asking whether we would have modern Western economic thinking? Which one are you asking about?
The second one.
Modern Western economic thinking.
Yes.
In that case, the answer is, I think, yes, we would. I think the insights that Smith gave us are powerful enough that sooner or later somebody would have figured that out. I don't want to argue that the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism was a necessary condition. I think it was a strongly contributing factor, but I don't, in the book, in any way pretend that it's the only contributing factor. I we've already talked about things like the fact that these people lived in an increasingly commercial society at the intellectual level. I've talked about the influence of Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. I chose to write my book about the influence of the change in religious thinking simply because the others are well known, things like the role of Newtonianism and the role of the importance of living in an increasingly commercial society. Those are all well known. What's not well understood is the role of this the change in religious thinking. So that's what I chose to write the book about. But I don't want, and while I do believe it was a very important contributing factor, I don't want to claim that it was a necessary condition in a strict sense, because that would mean that the Smithian ideas about competition and markets could not come into existence. Nobody could have those insights without in that case without the change in religious thinking, and I don't think that's true. Sooner or later, somebody would have had those ideas. But as a matter of the way history did play itself out, the person who gave us that was Smith. And the people who supported this effort were Smith's contemporaries. And so the question I was asking in the book was not, could these ideas sooner or later have appeared, but why did they actually did appear. They did appear in the 18th century. They did appear in the UK, and in particular in Scotland. And there were particular identifiable individuals who had those ideas. And that's the origin that I am trying to explain, did try to explain in the book. And for that purpose, I do want to point to the change in religious thinking as a very important contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, so the book is again Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Just before we go, are there any places on the internet you would like to mention where people can find your work?
Well, in terms of finding the book, there is well, first place, anything like anything in the world, from light bulbs to cosmetics to sinks to whatever building materials. Of course, people can get the book on Amazon, but also Penguin Random House has a website, and I'm sure they would be pleased if people ordered the book from them. The publisher is Knopf, Knopf, which is a very distinguished, I'm proud to say, American publisher, and they've been my publisher for years, and I'm proud of that. So anybody who enters into the internet, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, Knopf, or you can enter Penguin Random House, because with the consolidation in the publishing industry, which is a whole other conversation all in itself, some years ago, Knopf was bought by Random House. So I also think of my publisher as Random House. But of course, Random House merged with Penguin. And as I understand it, the whole thing is owned by Bertelsmann, which is in Germany. So it's all part of the same thing. So if public people go to the web and enter Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, Penguin or Penguin Random House or Random House, any of those will get them to the right place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Friedman, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing the channel for more than 3 years now, and it is thanks to people like you that it's been running for so long. And so if you like what I'm doing, please pay a visit to my Patreon page or to PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview, and to consider making a pledge there, support the show. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Parerga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnaud Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Idan Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Horowitz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal. My producers is Web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Venegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardos France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.